The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded like a weapon and slid under my door, and by the time I finished reading it, my hands were shaking with anger. According to the HOA, I was officially silenced. No meetings. No emails. No complaints. No appeals. One hidden rule, buried deep in a document no one ever talked about, had stripped me of my voice overnight. They said it calmly, legally, and with a smile that felt rehearsed. What they didn't know was that this single move would become the biggest mistake of their carefully protected careers, because the rule they used to shut me up was the same rule that would later expose everything. I had lived in the community for years. I paid my dues on time. I followed the rules, even when they were inconvenient or unfair. But when I started asking questions about missing funds and unexplained maintenance fees, the tone changed. Emails went unanswered. Neighbors stopped talking. Board members suddenly became busy. Then came that letter, citing a clause so obscure it sounded made up. The rule allowed the HOA to silence any homeowner deemed disruptive to community harmony. No warning. No vote. Just a decision made behind closed doors. At first, I felt defeated. The silence was loud. Watching meetings from the sidelines while decisions were made about my own home was humiliating. They expected me to give up, to sell, or to fall back in line. But something didn't sit right. That rule felt rushed, weaponized, and oddly specific. So instead of arguing, I started reading. Page by page. Amendment by amendment. I followed dates, signatures, and footnotes most people ignored. That's when I noticed something strange. The rule they used against me had a condition. A requirement so small it looked harmless, yet so powerful it controlled whether the rule even existed. It required a specific signature, from a specific authority, recorded within a specific time window. Without that signature, the rule wasn't enforceable. Without it, the HOA had no power to silence anyone at all. And when I checked the records, that signature was missing. Once I realized the signature was missing, my fear slowly turned into focus. This wasn't just about being silenced anymore, it was about whether the HOA had been enforcing rules that legally didn't exist. I printed every document I could find, spreading them across my dining table like puzzle pieces. Bylaws, amendments, meeting minutes, scanned PDFs with crooked dates and blurry stamps. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't an accident. The hidden rule appeared suddenly, slipped into an amendment during a year when very few homeowners attended meetings. The meeting minutes were vague, almost intentionally empty, filled with phrases like general discussion and administrative updates. No detailed vote counts. No homeowner acknowledgements. Just a quiet note saying the amendment was adopted unanimously. That alone raised red flags, but the real problem was what came next. According to the HOA's own bylaws, any amendment that restricted homeowner rights required validation from an external authority and a recorded signature to become enforceable. That signature was supposed to be public record, available upon request. Yet every copy I found ended at the same place, with a blank line where the signature should have been. Some versions didn't even include the page at all. It was as if they assumed no one would ever check. I requested the official record from the HOA office. The response came quickly, almost too quickly. They sent the same unsigned document and added a short note reminding me that I was currently restricted from further inquiries under the Community Harmony Clause. Reading that line felt surreal. They were using an invalid rule to prevent me from questioning whether the rule itself was valid. That's when I started talking to my neighbors quietly. Not accusing. Just asking simple questions. Did anyone remember voting on this rule? Had anyone seen the signed amendment? Most people shook their heads. A few admitted they'd been fined or warned under the same clause. One neighbor whispered that the rule only seemed to be used against people who questioned money. By the end of the week, I had copies of bank summaries, unsigned amendments, and written statements from homeowners who had been silenced just like me. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. And patterns don't lie. Armed with documents and growing confidence, I decided to stop playing defense. If the HOA believed silence would protect them, they had underestimated how powerful paper trails could be. I filed a formal records request, not just to the HOA, but to the county office that archived community governance filings. Unlike the HOA, the county couldn't ignore me. They had deadlines, laws, consequences. When the envelope arrived from the county, it felt heavier than paper should. Inside were certified copies of every amendment the HOA had ever filed. I flipped through them slowly, heart pounding with every page. And there it was. The amendment containing the so-called Community Harmony Rule. Filed late. Missing attachments. And most importantly, marked as incomplete. A bold stamp on the margin read, "Not valid without authorizing signature." That stamp changed everything. The HOA hadn't just skipped a step. They never had the authority to enforce the rule at all. For years, they had fined homeowners, removed speaking rights, and threatened legal action using a clause that had never legally existed. The silence they created wasn't accidental. It was manufactured. I scheduled a meeting with an attorney, laying everything out in chronological order. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question my interpretation. He just nodded, occasionally circling dates with a pen. When I finished, he leaned back and said words I'll never forget, "This isn't just misconduct. This is exposure." According to him, every action taken under that rule was now questionable. Fines could be refunded. Decisions could be overturned. And if the rule had been used to suppress financial inquiries, the board members could be held personally responsible. That's when I understood why they tried so hard to silence me. It wasn't about harmony. It was about containment. Word began spreading faster than I expected. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact now stopped me to talk. Some were angry. Others were relieved. A few admitted they had sold their homes under pressure from the same rule. The community atmosphere shifted, not into chaos, but into awareness. The HOA noticed too. Emails suddenly came through again, carefully worded and overly polite. They suggested a private resolution and asked that I stop causing confusion. But the truth was already out, and truth doesn't go back into hiding once it's seen daylight. The only thing left was deciding how public this was going to become. The moment the HOA suggested a private resolution, I knew they were scared. Fear changes behavior, and theirs was suddenly cautious, polite, almost submissive. The same board members who once ignored my emails were now copying attorneys and using words like miscommunication and good faith oversight. But paperwork doesn't miscommunicate. Signatures don't accidentally disappear. And rules don't enforce themselves for years without intent. I declined the private meeting. Instead, I asked for something far more dangerous to them: transparency. I requested that the HOA place the disputed rule on the agenda for the next open community meeting, along with the county's stamped documents confirming its invalid status. Legally, they couldn't refuse without drawing even more attention. Reluctantly, they agreed. That meeting was packed. Chairs ran out. People stood along the walls, neighbors I'd never seen attend before clutching folders of their own. When the board president began speaking, his voice lacked the confidence it once had. He described the rule as procedural and misunderstood, carefully avoiding the word invalid. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply projected the county documents onto the screen behind me. The missing signature. The incomplete filing stamp. The date mismatch. One by one, the room shifted. You could feel the realization spreading as homeowners connected their own experiences to that single blank line where a signature should have been. Questions erupted. About fines. About threats. About money. The board tried to regain control, calling for order, but control had already slipped away. A homeowner stood up and asked why she'd paid thousands in penalties under a rule that never existed. Another demanded to know why his voting rights were removed. Someone else asked the question the board feared most: what else isn't real? The meeting ended early. Not because issues were resolved, but because the board adjourned abruptly, citing legal review. That night, emails flooded the community inbox. Apologies. Reversals. Promises of refunds pending verification. But it was too late for damage control. Within days, a petition circulated calling for a full audit and board resignations. Names filled the pages faster than anyone expected. Even former board allies signed. The illusion of authority had cracked, and once people see behind the curtain, they don't forget what they saw. What none of them realized yet was that the missing signature didn't just invalidate one rule. It invalidated every action connected to it, stretching back years. And the next document I uncovered would prove exactly how deep the scam really went. The audit request changed everything. Once the petition crossed the required threshold, the HOA could no longer control the narrative. An independent firm was brought in, and for the first time, the board wasn't the one deciding which documents people could see. Boxes were opened. Drives were copied. Old records that had been lost suddenly reappeared. And that's when the real story began to surface. The auditors focused first on the fines issued under the invalid rule. Hundreds of them. Each one tied to homeowners who had questioned fees, challenged decisions, or asked for financial clarity. The pattern was undeniable. Anyone who asked too much was labeled disruptive and silenced. But fines were only the surface. When auditors traced where that money went, the trail grew darker. Large portions of collected penalties had been rerouted into vague expense categories like consulting, administrative resolution, and special services. No invoices. No explanations. Just approvals signed by the same 3 board members, over and over again. Those approvals referenced the very rule that didn't legally exist. It was the backbone of everything they'd done. One auditor requested bank authorization documents for these transfers. That's where the second signature issue emerged. Several accounts required dual authorization, but only one signature appeared repeatedly. The same board member. The same handwriting. The same dates. It suggested that internal controls were ignored entirely. As word spread, more homeowners came forward. One produced an email threatening foreclosure if she didn't stop requesting receipts. Another shared a recording where a board member openly admitted the rule was a pressure tool. Every story aligned. Silence wasn't a side effect. It was the goal. The HOA's attorney resigned halfway through the audit, citing irreconcilable differences. 2 board members followed soon after, stepping down quietly and removing their names from public listings. The president stayed, insisting everything would be clarified, but clarity was no longer enough. Then the auditors found it. A document referenced in multiple transactions but never shared publicly. An internal memo outlining how the community harmony rule could be used to minimize resistance during budget reallocations. It listed scenarios, talking points, even suggested warning language. And at the bottom of the page was a single signature. Not the one legally required to make the rule valid, but the one that tied the entire operation together. That signature proved intent. It showed planning. It showed awareness. And it showed that the missing signature wasn't an oversight at all. It was deliberate. Once that memo became part of the official audit record, the issue stopped being an HOA dispute. It became a legal one. And that's when external authorities stepped in. When external authorities became involved, the HOA's tone shifted from defensive to desperate. Letters from regulatory offices arrived, requesting explanations, timelines, and justifications for actions taken over several years. What had once been dismissed as internal community matters was now framed as potential financial misconduct. The board could no longer hide behind closed meetings or vague language. Every decision had to be explained on record. Investigators focused heavily on intent. Mistakes can be forgiven. Systems can fail. But patterns supported by written guidance and repeated actions tell a different story. The internal memo uncovered during the audit became the centerpiece. It demonstrated that the board knew the rule's power came from fear, not legality. They had designed it to discourage questions, not to maintain harmony. As interviews began, contradictions surfaced immediately. One board member claimed the rule had been properly approved, only to later admit they had never seen a signed version. Another insisted fines were evenly applied, despite records showing the opposite. Each statement was documented, compared, and quietly dismantled. The silence tactic that once worked so effectively against homeowners now worked against the board itself. Meanwhile, the community changed. Meetings were no longer tense. They were determined. Homeowners spoke openly, sharing experiences they'd kept hidden for years. People who had moved away sent statements describing pressure and threats. Refund calculations were posted publicly, and the numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands collected under an invalid rule, with interest owed. The remaining board president attempted one last maneuver. He proposed a retroactive approval of the rule, arguing it would correct administrative gaps. Authorities shut it down immediately. You can't sign something years later and pretend it always existed. Law doesn't work that way. Power doesn't either. Then came the formal notices. The HOA was instructed to suspend enforcement of multiple policies pending review. Board elections were ordered to be supervised. Financial accounts were temporarily frozen to prevent further misuse. What had once been an unchallenged authority was now under watch. Privately, I was offered settlements more than once. Refunds. Waived dues. Even public apologies. All in exchange for silence. Again. I declined every time. This had never been about money for me. It was about restoring voices that had been taken away. The most telling moment came when one investigator said, "This started because you asked to see a signature." That was all it took. One missing name on one page revealed years of manipulation. But the biggest consequence hadn't arrived yet. Because when authority is built on something that never legally existed, everything connected to it begins to collapse. And the final chapter of the story would decide whether the HOA survived at all. The supervised election was the moment everything truly unraveled. For the first time in years, the HOA board would be chosen without insider control, without selective rule enforcement, and without fear hanging over the room. Observers from outside agencies attended, ballots were verified, and every procedure was documented. The result was decisive. Nearly the entire old board was voted out in a single night. Homeowners who had once been silenced were now being elected to lead. But removing the board didn't erase the past. Investigators continued working through years of decisions tied to the invalid rule. Contracts approved under it were flagged. Vendor relationships were re-examined. Several agreements were found to be overpriced, rushed, and approved without competitive bids. Each one traced back to moments when homeowner opposition had been suppressed. Silence had been profitable. The most damaging discovery came from email archives. Messages revealed board members discussing how long they could operate under the radar before someone noticed the missing authorization. One email even joked that no one reads the bylaws anyway. Reading those words felt surreal. The disrespect wasn't just for the rules. It was for the people living under them. As findings were finalized, consequences followed. One former board member was barred from holding fiduciary roles in similar organizations. Another faced civil action to recover misused funds. Insurance providers refused to renew coverage without major structural changes. The HOA's reputation extended far beyond the neighborhood now, serving as a cautionary example for other communities. For homeowners, the emotional impact was just as significant as the legal one. People spoke about years of anxiety, about feeling powerless in their own homes. Some cried during meetings, not out of anger, but relief. The silence was gone, replaced by something far stronger: accountability. I was asked more than once if I regretted not accepting the early settlements. The answer was always no. If I had stopped at a refund or an apology, the system that enabled everything would still be intact. Real change required discomfort. It required exposure. The new board worked quickly, rewriting policies, restoring rights, and creating safeguards to ensure no single rule could ever again be weaponized in secret. Transparency became mandatory, not optional. Every amendment required public review, recorded votes, and verified signatures. Looking back, it still amazed me how fragile unchecked authority really is. It took years to build, but it collapsed under the weight of one missing signature and one person unwilling to stay quiet. Yet the story didn't end with reform. Because what happened next would redefine not just the HOA, but the people who lived under it. The final outcome would prove that silence, once broken, can never truly be restored. With the old board gone and reforms underway, the neighborhood felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. People who once hurried past each other now stopped to talk. Meetings that used to feel hostile turned into long, thoughtful discussions. But healing didn't mean forgetting. The damage caused by years of silence couldn't be undone overnight, and many homeowners were still dealing with consequences that stretched far beyond fines and fees. Several families were in the middle of legal disputes that had started under the invalid rule. Foreclosure threats, liens, forced sales. The new board worked with attorneys to pause every active action connected to the exposed policy. Case by case, records were reviewed. Some homeowners received refunds. Others received letters formally clearing their names. For many, it was the first time the HOA had ever admitted it was wrong. What struck me most was how close this all came to never being discovered. If I hadn't questioned that letter, if I hadn't read the fine print, if I'd accepted silence like they expected, the rule would still be in place, quietly controlling people's lives. That realization stayed with me. Systems don't collapse because they're powerful. They collapse because someone notices the weak point. The community decided to document everything. A full report was created, outlining how the rule was introduced, enforced, and abused. It wasn't written for revenge. It was written as a warning. Copies were shared with other HOAs, local housing groups, and homeowner advocacy organizations. The story spread further than anyone anticipated. Other communities reached out, asking how to check their own bylaws, how to protect themselves from similar tactics. The irony was impossible to ignore. A rule designed to silence had given hundreds of people a voice, not just here, but elsewhere too. Conversations about transparency and accountability began happening in places where no one had dared question authority before. All because one signature was missing, and someone cared enough to notice. Personally, the experience changed how I saw power. It isn't always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it hides in paperwork, in assumptions, in the belief that no one will ever look closely. And resistance doesn't always start with shouting. Sometimes it starts with reading. As months passed, the investigations wrapped up, settlements were finalized, and new policies took hold. The HOA survived, but it was unrecognizable from what it once was. Smaller. Watched. Accountable. Exactly how it should have been from the beginning. Still, one question lingered in every conversation I had: what was the final cost of that silence? Not in dollars, but in trust. And whether trust, once broken so completely, could ever be fully restored. The answer came sooner than anyone expected, and it would define how the story truly ended. The final cost of silence became clear at the annual community gathering, the first one held without tension hanging in the air. Attendance was higher than it had ever been. Not because people were afraid, but because they finally felt it mattered to show up. The new board presented a closing report, detailing refunds issued, policies corrected, and safeguards installed. Numbers were shared openly. Mistakes were named plainly. For the first time, the HOA spoke with honesty instead of authority. But trust is slower to rebuild than systems. During the open forum, a homeowner stood up and said something that stopped the room. He explained that years earlier, he'd stopped speaking at meetings because every question made him feel targeted. He'd stayed quiet to protect his family, even when things felt wrong. His voice shook, not with anger, but with regret. Others followed, sharing stories of compliance rooted in fear. Silence, it turned out, had a long shadow. That was when the community made its most important decision. Beyond rule changes and elections, they voted to add a permanent requirement: any homeowner could request documentation for any rule, fee, or decision, without penalty. No labels. No retaliation. Just access. It was simple, but powerful. Silence would never again be an option forced on anyone. As the meeting ended, people thanked me, but I never felt comfortable with that. This was never about me being brave. It was about being stubborn enough to read one more page when they expected me to stop. Anyone could have done it. That truth mattered, because it meant this kind of power only exists when people assume it does. Looking back, the most shocking part wasn't the scam itself. It was how ordinary it was. No dramatic villain. No single explosive moment. Just a rule slipped in quietly, enforced confidently, and accepted without question. Until it wasn't. Until one missing signature reminded everyone that authority without legitimacy is just paper pretending to be power. Today, the neighborhood is quieter in a different way. Not silent, but calm. Conversations happen openly. Disagreements exist, but they aren't punished. The HOA still operates, but it no longer rules. It serves. That distinction makes all the difference. The hidden rule that once erased voices ended up amplifying them. The attempt to silence exposed a system built on fear. And the signature meant to make everything legal never appeared, because it was never meant to. They relied on no one looking. They were wrong. And that's the real ending. Not revenge. Not victory. Just proof that silence breaks the moment someone decides to read, question, and refuse to look away.